Brought to you by concordiatheology.org, bringing you resources that support the vigorous life of the mind in service of the gospel of Christ.
Welcome to Lectionary Kickstart. We're sparking your thoughts for Sunday as you plan your sermon or teaching lesson. I'm your host and producer, Jessica Bordelot, here with Dr. David Schmidt and Dr. Peter Napsker. They're both professors of homiletics here at Concordia Seminary, St. Louis. You can hear all about us in our introductory episode, but trust me, they are pretty good preachers. All right, let's get started. David, where are we in the church year?
We are celebrating Pentecost, the time when the church remembers the descent of the Holy Spirit, the speaking in tongues, the bringing of salvation to all nations of the earth.
And Peter, what are the texts this week?
The texts are from Genesis 11, Acts 2, John 14, and Psalm 143.
So as always, I ask each of you to tell me which text you would choose to preach about. To determine who goes first today. So we have all of the language confusion in the Tower of Babel and people speaking all different languages in Pentecost. Which language that you don't know do you wish you knew?
I wish I knew Spanish. I tried taking it, and then I just didn't have the time, but yeah.
Since you said Spanish, I'll say Mandarin. Because I heard, Jerry Bodie said this one time, that if you could speak English, Spanish, and Mandarin, you could cover something like 2/3 of the world's population.
Wow.
He said this because there are some seminaries that are training or requiring that students take Spanish and Mandarin because then they can get out to almost a lot of the world. So I think Mandarin would be cool.
I really liked your answer, Peter. So you get to go first. You win.
I would preach on Acts 2. Pentecost, we've talked about these kind of things before.
I know what you're going to say. Pentecost is so hard to write a sermon for. It's so hard to preach on Pentecost. You guys say that every time.
Well, the funny thing is, I was preparing to say that again. And then I just started looking at Acts chapter 2. There's two ways to go about it, seems like, on these festivals. Either you lean into the text that everybody's thinking about, the event of Pentecost, or you try to give them an angle on a familiar event with a different text. And this week, I guess, as I was looking at it, I thought, I just want to dig into Acts chapter 2 and tell the story of the descent of the Spirit on the people of God. And so I think what I would do is look at this as a narrative sermon where I try to locate the story of Pentecost, what happened there within the bigger narrative, and then try to make some connections along the way. So, first of all, I would point out, and I don't know how you communicate in this sermon exactly, but this is such a strange event. Mm-hmm. When you step back away from, we're so familiar with it as Christians, but it's so weird that they're gathered together in this room, and the rushing sound and the flames of fire, and it's such a weird event. That I would want to acknowledge the strangeness and lean into that, and point out how this is something kind of remarkable happening here. And then I would I think I would divide the sermon in basically three ways to think about what's happening in this strange event. The first would draw from verse 1. Would you read verse 1 from Acts chapter 2, Jessica?
When the day of Pentecost arrived, they were all together in one place.
Okay, they were all together. Now, why were they all together in one place?
Because they were waiting. Jesus said to wait.
In Acts chapter 1, 4-5, he says, wait for power from on high. And so the first part of this, telling the story, I would call the promise of the Spirit. Jesus promised, back in the reading from John 14, a little bit further in John, Jesus promised several times that this would come, and so I would emphasize that this Spirit was promised. And so the disciples, as they gathered together, were trusting in and looking forward to the fulfillment of the promise that Jesus both on Maundy, Thursday made, and then also after his resurrection. So the promise is huge here.
I really like that. I think sometimes we read stories, and particularly familiar stories, we read them too quickly, and we don't lean into or experience or meditate on what they're like moment by moment. The disciples are waiting for the promise of the Holy Spirit, but we have points in our life where we're waiting for promises.
Well, the whole Christian life is living by a promise. And so this itself is they're there, they're obedient, they're expectant.
Right, you think about like the parable where Jesus talks about the servants of the household and whether they're waiting for the master to return, and how they keep the household running, expecting the master to return. And you have these routines, you have this way of living that's all based on a promise coming true, and what it's like to do that. Particularly when you live in a world that doesn't think the promise will come true at all. I mean, it's just
So you've got the disciples waiting for the promise. You've got this promise of the Spirit, and then you've got the Christian life is a life living by the promise.
Right.
So whether you divide them up like that, or whether you just go through I'm going to suggest 3 that you could go through, all from the text, and then all for your hearers, or kind of go back and forth.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So you could do either one. The second kind of move would be to think about the power of the Spirit. So you've got the promise of the Spirit and the power of the Spirit. Would you read verse 4, Jessica?
And they were all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit gave them utterance.
Okay, the power here, that I would think of the power in terms of doing something that you can't do on your own.
Mm-hmm.
The Spirit
Speak
empowers. Speak Mandarin, right. If I tell you, when I was studying German, I actually did pray for the power of tongues because I was so frustrated not being able to understand or communicate. But these guys were equipped to do things they could not do. I think about our lives, if you're going to go back now to our lives. There are things that God calls us to do that we cannot do. I cannot forgive that person. I cannot share the gospel with those people.
I cannot turn the other cheek.
I cannot turn the other cheek. I cannot bear this burden. I cannot get by another day. I can't even get up and have breakfast. I can't
get through this temptation.
Right.
Yeah.
So many things that we cannot do. And yet the Spirit that God sent at Pentecost in fulfillment of the promise is a Spirit that empowers people to do the things they cannot do. So pick your fruit of the Spirit. Pick whatever command it is that God has given us that we just can't do. That would be a word of encouragement that the same Spirit that descended upon the disciples is a Spirit that was given to each believing Christian at baptism. And that Spirit does actually empower us to do these hard things. So that would be kind of a word of encouragement. The third move then would be to think about the purpose of the Spirit. So you've got promise, power, purpose. And for this, I would look at would you read verse 17 and 18 and then also 21, Jessica?
And in the last days it shall be, God declares, that I will pour out my Spirit on all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. Even on my male servants and female servants in those days I will pour out my Spirit, and they shall prophesy. And it shall come to pass that everyone who calls upon the name of the Lord shall be saved.
Okay, now just notice that there's the stuff from Joel. It's from Joel, right?
Yes.
The prophesying, the sons and the daughters, the visions, all this stuff that's coming to fruition here at Pentecost, so that, verse 21, others can call on the name of the Lord and be saved. When you look at a strange event in the Scriptures, I think it's probably not helpful just to marvel at the strangeness, but to see what is the strangeness, kind of to what end. Mm-hmm. What is God doing?
Why is it happening this way?
And I love how this lectionary ends at verse 21, or I should say includes verse 21, because it gets to the whole purpose of this thing, that everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. And so this is where you could tie in the mission of God that Jesus came and fulfilled through his life and ministry and death and resurrection is now going forth through his church, so that all people will call on the name of the Lord and all will be saved. And so this Pentecost is not just a strange event just to marvel at, but it's one that has a definite purpose, and we're part of that.
And we participate in it.
And we participate in it.
Right.
And so that's where the connection to our lives would be. The Spirit works through us. He works through our faithful speaking, through our sharing of the gospel. And so just as the promise, the power, and the purpose of the Spirit was present there in Acts chapter 2, so also that same Spirit is alive in the church in our lives today.
I like that because sometimes people think of, Christmas is celebrating God the Father, and Easter celebrating God the Son, and Pentecost, God the Holy Spirit, and then you get to Trinity. And here you really are focusing on the Holy Spirit, but you're putting it into this narrative that shows us the working of the Spirit then and thinking about the working of the Spirit in our lives today.
Yeah, the continuity between the work of the Spirit then and now would be an important part of this.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Thank you, Peter. David, what about you?
Well, I also would go with Acts 2.
All right, why would you go with
I know.
Acts 2?
Well, I was reading it, and the story just struck me. And there was but differently than you, I wasn't really interested in the whole story. I was interested in one thing that happened in the story, and kind of just meditating on how that would shape our life today. That's kind of what was going on with me. So, Jessica, if you could read verse 4 through 12, and this has all of those names in it.
Thank you. I
You're
appreciate
welcome.
that. Listeners, today is the comedy version of Lectionary Kickstart. And they were all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit gave them utterance. Now they were dwelling in Jerusalem, Jews, devout men from every nation under heaven. And at this sound the multitude came together, and they were bewildered because each one was hearing them speak in his own language. And they were amazed and astonished, saying, "Are not all these who are speaking Galileans? How is it that we hear each of us in his native tongue and his own native language?" All right, here comes the fun part. Perinthians and Medes and Elamites and residents of Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia. How do you say it?
You just say it confidently. Cappadocia.
And Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia and Egypt and all the parts of longing to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabians. Ah, made it. All right. We hear them telling in our own tongue the mighty works of God. And all were amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, "What does this mean?"
I love that. Thank you.
I'm sure you did. I'm sure that was very entertaining.
No. I love the actual listing of all of the different tongues, right? Because it kind of, the event all of the sudden brings starkly to your attention the fact that God is reaching out to all nations. And it's just beautiful. And the way God is reaching out to all nations is by putting his message of salvation into their language. That is so important. I had a friend who felt like he was being forced out of his job to retire. What had happened at his job was he sold things, and they converted their sales force from working with paper copies to working with digital copies on an iPad. And so he found that he had to be out in the sun, out in the rain, holding an umbrella, holding an iPad, and trying to operate this iPad to input orders in a digital format. And he just couldn't do it. He could not learn the digital language. And although he was capable at his job and able to do it in his own language, that is, with paper copies, he couldn't do it with the digital. And he just felt like he was forced out and he didn't belong. And you think about Pentecost. God, it's a miracle, right? God could have miraculously made everyone understand Hebrew and Greek. He could have done that. He could have opened all of their minds. So whether you're a Parthian or a Phrygian or a Cretan, you understand Hebrew and Greek and Aramaic, so parts of Daniel also, right? So you would know the original languages, but God doesn't. God doesn't force everyone to know Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic in order to hear the message of salvation. Instead, God puts that message of salvation in everyone else's language so that no one is left out. And I just think, what does that mean that God chooses to put his message in other languages? Why would that be meaningful to people?
Well, they call your first language your heart language, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So what does that mean? If it's your heart language.
You don't have to translate it in your mind while you're listening to it, right? It's the language your mom spoke to you when you were little.
Right.
The one that you probably think in.
Right.
It's pure reception.
Yeah.
I think there's a gospel connection here, and that when you're translating, when you're trying to understand something, you're at work. I'm really trying to understand what each of these words mean. But when somebody speaks to you in a language you already know, you just receive.
Yeah.
And so it's pure gift.
And they're the ones who are working.
Right. They're working for you. Right.
Right. They're working
Yeah.
to put the language. So, so it's a heart language. So there's an aspect of hospitality to this, that God is not forcing you to enter into a completely another language in order to be saved. God brings salvation into your home.
It's like incarnational.
Right, yes,
Yeah.
It is incarnational, and it's so beautiful. And when you think about it, you think about sometimes, when we look at the world and we think about bringing people to the church, we think to ourselves, here's all the things I need to teach them in order to bring them into the church, because they've got to understand our language in order to be part of our congregation. When in fact, maybe instead of thinking about what we're going to say to them and teach them in order that they can come into the church, we should be listening to what they're saying, because our question is not, what do I have to teach them to get them into the church about my language, but how can I put this message of salvation into their language?
Well, and that's what you're highlighting there. This is not, changing your teaching in some way.
No,
in any way.
not at all.
It's the message of salvation and the good word that God has given us. We speak in the languages of the people we're called to serve. And that's hard to, apart from the Spirit coming and just opening your mouth, that's hard to do.
It is.
But that's the way of the Lord.
Right. So I want to get to know, how do you express love? How do you express sorrow? How do you express anger? What burdens are you trying to put into words? And so that I can bring the message of God's saving work into your world, so that you hear it. And then when I do it, sometimes, I don't know, I've noticed sometimes if I'm talking with people and there's like a language barrier, and I'll say something, and when they finally get it, they finally understand what I'm trying to communicate, then they're like, oh, we would put it this way, right? And so they have their own language. They have a better sense of how to say love in their language than you do, but you're doing the best you can to bring it in. And then once they hear it, then they have a better sense of it. And that's the beauty of the kind of the dialogue, the conversation that's going to happen. Sometimes I think about our hymnal this way. I really do. That you look at our hymnal, and if you look at it in terms of languages, it is such a beautiful document, right? We've got Greek in there, we've got the Kyrie, we've got Latin in there, we've got Hebrew in there, we've got English, we've got French and Spanish and German and Danish and Norwegian. You've got all of these languages that are now singing these songs of praises to God as we have this multicultural hymnal, right? Because you got all these different languages present in there, and that's what this Pentecost is about, is that when we share this wonderful message of salvation to other people in their heart language, they then can begin to sing that message of salvation in ways that I might never have thought of, because they're bringing it out of their language to the world. And it's kind of this blessing. It's this two-way communication or two-way blessing that's happening. And so that would be I would probably focus on the two blessings of this way in which God works. One is that he's opening salvation to all people, bringing salvation into their heart language, and I want to talk about heart languages and what that indicates, what that connotes for us, what the connotations of that are. And then two, that God then has his church hear from all of these languages the songs of praise that come from his people.
I think you said earlier, Dave, when you introduced the day of the year, we celebrate the descent of the Spirit
Yeah.
at Pentecost. I think about, as I'm hearing you talk, I'm thinking about God's condescension to us.
Right.
And what I want to think about is, it's not like we're condescending to others when we speak in their language. It's that God has condescended to us in our language, and then he invites us to spread that around. So the incarnation, the taking on flesh, the taking on human speech,
Right.
we have been just as much recipients of that as anyone else for whom we would translate.
Right.
So we're all on this level of receiving the Spirit and the Word in our own heart languages. That puts us on kind of the same playing field as everybody else.
Yeah.
I think this is a case for children's messages as part of worship, because there are different languages within English. And let me tell you, early childhood is its own language. And having someone who can translate the message to that language, I think that's huge. A case for having junior high youth group and high school youth group. They're at a point where their English is a little bit different too, and having translators that can teach them.
Right.
That's not changing the message, but it's putting it in a language that they can understand.
Right.
There's a museum in Washington, D.C. I can't think of the name of it for the life of me. I think it might be called Planet Word. But it's a museum about language. It's fascinating. It just opened 5 years ago or so. And one of the things they have is they have all these interactive things where you can look at how words work. But they described, they had kind of like a quiz, and they asked who are the most significant shapers of language. You know, is it English teachers? Is it professors? Is it politicians? Is it journalists?
Linguists, yeah.
You know who it is? It's young people. It's youth. They come up with new words that then kind of get passed upwards. And so you mentioned that with kids. The words they use some weird words, but that does actually shape language. That's probably got nothing to do with the podcast. But I thought it was interesting.
It absolutely does. If we're talking about incarnational communication, coming to a child in a language that they understand is very important. And I think sometimes we forget that they're there too. Now, obviously they're going to grow into an understanding of their language where they can understand more and more. But they're part of the church right now, not when they grow up. And so speaking to them right now, I think, is really important. Thank you, David. That's all for today. We have more free resources to guide your next step in planning at concordiatheology.org. Check it out. While you're there, you'll also find episodes of our other podcast. It's called Tangible Theology Learned and Lived. Twice a month, I host conversations with faculty. We talk about the ways in which their understanding of God and faith and theology is real in their everyday lives. The show is for anyone who wants to deepen their theology. Tell your congregation about it. Tangible Theology Learned and Lived. You can find more episodes of Lectionary Kickstart and Tangible on any of the major podcast apps. If you'd like to see the show continue, please subscribe for free, share, leave a review. I'm your host and producer, Jessica Bordelot. Join us next week here at Lectionary Kickstart when Dr. David Schmidt and Dr. Peter Napsker will spark your thoughts for next Sunday. Judea, Cappadocia? Blast. Cappadocia? How do you say it?
That's when you should have spoken in Elvish.